Good afternoon. You can all hear me, even at the back? Wonderful. Good afternoon. My name is James Herrera-Brooks, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Melanie Trent DeShudder Senior Director of Research and Publications here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And of course, I'm delighted to welcome you to the VMHC on a sunny afternoon for another installment in our Scholar Series. Before we begin, as always, I wish to acknowledge the generous support of Comrade Mercer Hall, who has endowed this program. Comrade serves as an honorary vice chair of our Board of Trustees and has been a champion of our work for decades. We also wish to acknowledge former VMHC President and CEO, Dr. Charles F. Bryan, Jr., whom this series also honors. Before we begin with today's program, I just want to make you aware of a few upcoming events, although I have a feeling that you are probably already majorly aware of everything that we're getting up to in June. So just as a reminder, we are coming up on two major VMHC events this June as we build momentum towards the nation's 250th. First, with Richmond Sail Fest, held on the James River from this coming Friday to this Sunday, and then Illumination towards the end of the month, which will be an incredible art projection event that will bring America's story to life upon the historic facade of our building on Arthur Ashe Boulevard. So that's going to be beginning the evening of June 25th. And you can visit our website for more information on both of those events. In terms of our regular Scholar Series programming, we're going to be meeting here again at noon on June 23rd, and we'll be welcoming Dr. Melvin Ely for a talk on his latest book, A Terrible Intimacy, Interracial Life in the Slaveholding South. And if you are unaware, last month, Dr. Ely retired from William & Mary after decades of excellent teaching and research, so I consider this an important opportunity to hear from an amazing Virginia historian, and I hope you won't miss it. And something else I learned of today, and if you missed it before the talk, Legacy Roasters, who are a local Virginia coffee company, they were outside the cafe in the lead up to this talk, and they're going to be around for an extra hour after this talk finishes. So you can go over there, you can enjoy a pour-over sample, and you can hear more about their story. And obviously, that connects well with today's talk. Before we begin, right now, I just want to give a quick reminder, if you have any device that can beep, ring, buzz, vibrate, make any kind of noise that might distract today's speaker or everyone who is gathered here today to enjoy the talk, I'd ask you to take a moment to just make sure that that is switched to Do Not Disturb or off. Coffee is among the most important goods traded and consumed worldwide, and so omnipresent its popularity that it is often taken for granted. But even everyday habits have a history. When and why coffee became part of North American daily life is at the center of today's talk. Grounded in deep, comprehensive research, today's speaker follows coffee from the slavery-based plantations of the Caribbean and South America through the balance sheets of colonial North Americans and ultimately, I guess I need some coffee, onto the balance sheets of Atlantic world merchants, into the coffee houses, stores, and homes of colonial North Americans, and ultimately into the growing import-export businesses of the early 19th century United States that rebranded this exotic good as an American staple. Dr. Michelle Craig McDonald has spent 3 decades as an educator and administrator in universities, museums, and historic sites. She has worked for 17 years at Stockton University as both a faculty member and an administrator, including as the Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs and Chief Academic Officer for the Atlantic City campus. Her work with public history institutions includes Colonial Williamsburg, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and most recently as director of the Library and Museum at the American Philosophical Society. She has also appeared in documentaries about Philadelphia and is a frequent contributor and now academic advisor to the PBS series Drive-By History. Dr. McDonald's research focuses on trade and consumer behavior in North America and the Caribbean during the 18th and 19th centuries and has been supported by grants by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Fulbright Foundation, the Harvard Business School, the Library Company of Philadelphia, and this is just to name but a few. Her most recent book, and of course the focus of today's event, is Coffee Nation: How One Commodity Transformed the Early United States. And I just want to add that I've had the pleasure of spending time and working with Dr. McDonald as part of the Independent Research Library Association, of which the VMHC is a member. And she is an incredible scholar, an incredible storyteller, and I am very excited for her talk today, and I'm sure you all are too. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Michelle Craig McDonald.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to begin by thanking James Herrera Brooks, who is the person who invited me to join you this afternoon. I would also very much like to thank Graham Dozier for all of his work in coordinating the arrangements so that I could join you on this Thursday at noon. And of course, all of you for choosing to spend part of your Thursday, admittedly a rather warm Thursday, so I suspect that you're happier inside than outside, with me learning about the history of coffee and about the history of early America. I start, as many historians do, with a story that will probably sound familiar in some respects, but hopefully not in others. And it takes place on a July morning in 1777, just a little over a year after North America's 13 colonies had declared their independence from Britain. That day, women began gathering in front of a particular warehouse in Boston. At first, there were only a few. But by mid-morning, there were dozens. And by the time the owner of that warehouse arrived, a merchant named Thomas Boylston, more than 100 women were there to greet him. Yeah, it wasn't a moment of great happiness. I will go ahead and tip my hand. For years, the city's residents had been complaining about the price of their groceries. And I will say that when I was finishing this book, I did not realize how many moments of resonance there would be to contemporary news. This is the first one. They had good reason. The cost of goods in Boston had been going up and up and up since the city had passed its non-importation agreement in 1768 to protest the Townshend duties. The price of everything had skyrocketed. And the situation only got worse after the outbreak of war. Abigail Adams was in Boston when this incident took place, and so it's through her letters, their correspondence, that I could tease out what happened. She wrote frequently to John about the challenges of living in a city under siege, as well as Bostonians' growing irritation with merchants and with shopkeepers. There is a general cry against the merchants, she'd written to him earlier that year, who 'tis said have created a partial scarcity for every article, not only of luxury, but even the necessaries of life. Those 100+ women who gathered to confront Boylston in 1777 had one very specific necessary of life in mind: coffee. As James noted, today coffee is traded and consumed worldwide, and it is so common that its history is often taken for granted. But why coffee became so embroiled, so entangled with the early American story is at the center of Coffee Nation: How One Commodity Transformed the Early United States. Now, I'm often asked why I chose to write a book about the history of coffee. And the answer is, if I'm being candid, by accident. I applied to graduate school with the intention of studying the emergence of public education in the United States after the Civil War. This is not what I did. But in my first semester, I took a course in early modern British history. And since I was interested in education, I thought I would explore the concept of a term I was calling public literacy. How did people who did not know how to read or write get their news? How did they engage with public conversation of the day? So I began looking at places where news was read aloud, where debates happened publicly, where people could participate in the flow of information. So I was looking at places like taverns and inns, but especially at coffee houses, where events were held, public readings were common, debates were everyday currency. The next semester, I took a course in Atlantic history, which explored how the histories of Europe and the Americas and Africa became increasingly intertwined from the 15th century on. And since I'd already been reading about coffee houses, I thought I would go to the other side of the equation and explore where the coffee came from. So many scholars of the 17th and 18th century have studied sugar and the rise of sugar production. How many of you have read, if you think about the Caribbean and you think about plantations, how many of you would naturally think of sugar? Okay, fair number of you. How many of you would naturally think of coffee? That's why the book was necessary. All right, good. So I thought I would look at coffee cultivation, and this is what I found. While consumer historians have studied how and where coffee became popular in different parts of the world, most of their work was written as if the coffee was just there, ready to be consumed. By the same token, and I have a number of them here, so those that are on my right, your left, there you go. The books on your left are just a sampling of some of the books about coffee consumption, coffee drinking. By the same time, books about the commodity's production, most of which focus, and understandably so, on Central and South America, go into a lot of detail about how coffee is grown, how it's harvested, how it's packaged, how it's prepared for shipping, and then end there, at the docks, ready for the beans to be shipped abroad. Rarely did these authors speak to each other. Rarely did these authors cite each other's work. And that's how the idea for what was then my dissertation, what is now this book, came to be. A very broad history that follows coffee from its first domestication in Ethiopia, through early Middle Eastern trade routes and farming experiments into the East Indies, ultimately west across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, and ultimately into the stores, into the warehouses, and into the dining rooms of North America, which became, within a half century of American independence, one of the largest suppliers of coffee to the world. Now, this was not an easy project, although in all fairness, I do not know many historians who say, my research is a really easy project. How many historians do I have in the room? Raise your hands, go ahead. That's right. How many of you would say your research is easy? One person tentatively waved his hand. Tentatively. It's interesting, it's engaging, but rarely is it easy. And if I sat next to a historian who told me that their research was easy, I probably wouldn't want to spend terribly long next to them. There were no big coffee merchants in the 18th century, as there were, for example, linen merchants or wine merchants or even sugar merchants, people whose business primarily focused on one commodity, right? So there wasn't a big cache of business papers from a merchant firm or a distributor or an importer that I could really use to track this story over time. Instead, I wove the history of coffee together from brief notices that some number of bags or barrels of coffee had arrived in port, or that friends had gathered to share a cup of coffee in their home, or that they had gone to the coffee house for the latest political news. I followed coffee's history through account books, and through advertisements, and through books, and letters, and diaries, or, in the case of illicit activity, through courthouses, looking at cases of smuggling. But the sheer volume of these references demonstrates coffee's omnipresence in colonial America and the young United States. And it quickly becomes apparent that coffee is everywhere if you choose to look. So this afternoon, I've chosen 6 people from my book to help me tell this history, each one representing a different aspect of coffee's story: cultivation, trade, consumption, politics, smuggling, and advertising. And we start with this gentleman. This is Sir Nicholas Laws, who served as British Jamaica's colonial governor from 1718 until 1722. Now, Laws had grown up on a sugar plantation in Jamaica, but his family's success meant that, because of their wealth, he had spent much of his adult life back in England, and he only returned to Jamaica when the island was in trouble. Years of administrative mismanagement had resulted in a government rife with corruption and a colony deep in debt. I did mention that there's a lot of contemporary resonances. During his first 2 years in office, Laws wrote more than 40 letters, shipping reports, and depositions back to Parliament that documented everything from Spanish attacks on British ships, efforts to track down and capture enslaved people who escaped into Jamaica's interior. He also chronicled the devastating impact of hurricanes in Jamaica, and he presided over the trials of no less than 10 people accused of piracy. So is it little wonder that in 1722, all Laws wanted to do was to return at the age of 70 to his plantation and his botanical experiments. Now, he died less than a decade after he left office, but in his final years, he left Jamaica a legacy that proved more enduring, I would argue, than his efforts to staunch smuggling, provide hurricane relief, or even prosecute pirates. And that is because in 1728, Laws planted Jamaica's first coffee trees, forever changing the island's economy, its community, its landscape, as well as the lives of thousands and thousands of enslaved Africans and Afro-Jamaican workers coerced into this new commodity system. Laws only lived to see the first few harvests, but the crop was promising enough that more than 20 of his fellow planters, among them 2 women, petitioned Parliament for support. And Whitehall responded in 1732 with this: an act for encouraging the growth of coffee in His Majesty's plantations in America. It was the first of several laws that paved the way for cultivation to thrive in the British Caribbean. The results are readily apparent in the shift from British imperial coffee imports from east to west over the course of the 18th century. Now, I should probably pause and tell you that I describe myself as a business historian, which means I'm interested in the practice of business transactions, in trade, in commodities. I spend a lot of time counting. This is one of only 3 tables, I promise, in today's presentation. But they tell a good story. Numbers tell a good story. This particular table tells you a couple of things. So at the end of the 17th century, right, we don't have any coffee that's growing in the Americas, North America, South America, Central America, or the Caribbean. Instead, Britain, and this is the larger British Empire, not just North America, is importing some of its coffee from the Levant region still, where it began, or from East Indian experiments in places like Java or Bourbon. By the first quarter of the 19th century, you can see at least the volume of coffee production ticking up. By the time you get to the mid-18th century, 1749 to 51, you see 2 things. Again, the volume of coffee, the amount of coffee that's being produced is increasing, but you have a newcomer to the stage, and that is the West Indies. And by the time you get to the eve of the American Revolution, you have an appreciable increase. Look at that, 661,000 pounds to over almost 7 million pounds of coffee, and overwhelmingly coming from the Caribbean. That is the result of the kinds of protective tariffs, because that's what that 1732 legislation was. What Britain said was, if you purchased coffee produced anywhere in the British Empire, and you were within the British Empire, you paid no taxes. If, however, you chose to import coffee from anywhere else, from the East Indies, from the French Empire, from the Dutch Empire, from the Spanish Empire, you paid a hefty fee, right? So it differentiated different kinds of coffee. And it meant that the North Americans, ultimately, who were interested in coffee, were being increasingly tied together with their sister colonies in the West Indies. A generation later, the result of Britain's decision to invest in Caribbean production are easy to see. And this brings me to the second of this afternoon's characters, William West Jr., a merchant who in 1765 was waiting in Philadelphia's harbor for the arrival of a ship called the Polly. The Polly came from Kingston, Jamaica, and it was carrying casks of sugar and coffee, bags of limes, and barrels of rum. Someone liked the rum. That's okay. You're allowed to enjoy the rum. Many of us do, who do work in the Caribbean. It's one of the great benefits. I'll pause and say I did most of my research either here in the United States, mostly in Philadelphia, in England, at the National Records Office, National Archives in England, or in Jamaica. I lived in Jamaica for a year and a half, or in Dominica. And one of my fellow students who was studying trade on the Mississippi River said, "Boy, did I choose my topic poorly." Anywho, all right, so the Polly is coming in from Kingston, Jamaica. The goods on this ship were not unusual. These were common imports out of the Caribbean. They were popular with North American buyers, and the route that the ship was traveling was one that hundreds of ships would travel that year alone. William West was not unusual either. His family had come from Ireland in 1750, and he would ultimately serve as a captain in the 3rd Pennsylvania Regiment during the American Revolution. But that morning in 1765, thoughts of war were very far from his mind. Instead, he was waiting for his share of the Polly's coffee, which he would then reship out of Philadelphia as far south as Charleston, South Carolina. Another portion of that ship's cargo was owned by another merchant named William Redmond, and it would go as far north as Newport, Rhode Island. And then the final portion of that coffee was owned by a merchant firm called Craig, Fuller, and Ash, and they would ship it within the Mid-Atlantic, throughout Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, even here as far south as Virginia. Now, Philadelphia was not the only North American port city to import coffee, of course, but it brought in more than most, which is why I spend so much time on it in my book. Philadelphia had entered the West Indian trade later than both New York and Boston, which had secured those two cities really strong footholds in the sugar trade, and then by extension, rum and molasses, which are byproducts, right, of the sugar production industry. So rather than trying to compete, Philadelphia merchants cast around for other potential commodity markets in which to invest. By the 1760s, when West is standing on those docks, Philadelphia led North American importation in ginger, in pimento, which we call allspice, in pepper, but especially in coffee, accounting for at least a third and sometimes up to half of all of the coffee that came into North America in a given year. To see who bought it, table number 2. To see who bought it, I looked at tax lists, city directories, and newspaper advertisements. This last source was especially helpful. The number of you'll see a couple things. The number of vendors that are selling coffee almost doubles between 1765 and 1775. But that's only one trend that I found interesting. Just as important is what these notices tell us about where, and this is Philadelphia, where in the city coffee was being sold, and by extension, to whom. Who are coffee's drinkers? Philadelphia is divided into several wards at this point. So those are High Street, Chestnut, Walnut. Those are the names that you see on the far side of the table. About a third of all of the advertisements I could find of people selling coffee through groceries or dry goods stores were based in High Street, Chestnut, or Walnut Ward. And these are the districts that are closest to the city's ports and its largest public markets, which is to be expected. Another third of these sellers had their businesses based in North, Middle, and South Ward. These are very creative names. North, Middle, and South Ward, which house the principal business districts as well as some of the city's most affluent neighborhoods. So probably also not unexpected. But coffee was also sold in Upper and Lower Delaware wards, which were working class neighborhoods. It also appears in advertisements in Mulberry and Dock Ward, which were home to more marginal communities. Think widows, single women, most of Philadelphia's free black community. All of these had stores that advertised coffee. In other words, what these patterns tell me is that anyone who lived in any part of the city and who wanted to buy coffee could find it within walking distance. All of these drinkers benefited from the commercial networks created by William West and his fellow merchants, and helped to create the coffee market of North America, which tied it to the plantations that Governor Laws had begun in the West Indies. But this habit also tied us to Europe, which produced most of the ceramics and the metalwares used to brew and serve coffee, as well as the advice literature and the cookbooks that taught North American colonists how to do so. And social custom is precisely what concerned Jane Shippen, the third person that I am introducing you to today, when she wrote to her husband Joseph in 1772 about a trip she took to visit relatives in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Now, the Shippens were part of a very powerful and influential family in Philadelphia. It contained merchants and doctors and lawyers and landowners, many of them who held offices of local governance. Joseph's father, for example, had been elected to mayor of Philadelphia earlier in 1744. Now, overall, Jane thought that her visit was going very well. She thought the home was lovely. She thought the company was delightful, if a little provincial. But she took pains to alert her husband to what she considered a serious social gaffe. Her hosts, it seemed, would routinely put out fewer coffee cups than there were guests, and remedied the situation by putting out teacups. And this reminded Jane that half of her own coffee set was cracked or chipped, and she implored Joseph to order replacements so that she would not face the same dilemma. Now, what her letter, and I love these snapshots because they take a commodity and move it into a personal voice. What her letter illustrates is not only that coffee drinking was common, right? It's not just happening in urban centers like Philadelphia. It's happening in more rural communities like Lancaster, but also that rules of etiquette were coming into play. Some families could afford complete coffee sets, while others were less picky about these conventions, and so mixed and matched their crockery just to make do. Put another way, while more and more North Americans were drinking coffee, not all of them drank it the same way. They had choices. At the top of the market, the very top of the market, was sterling silver. This set is fashioned by Joseph Richardson Jr., who came from one of Philadelphia's most noted silversmith families. It is a work of art. It is beautifully fashioned. It is extremely expensive. For those who wanted the look of silver but could not afford the luxury of sterling, silver plate was an option. In fact, with the advent of Sheffield plating, which bonded silver to copper using a small amount of zinc and lead, Coffee pots could be plated on the inside as well as the outside, and it became nearly impossible for the casual observer to tell the difference. You could, if you wanted to, pick up the coffee pot and look at the bottom. You could open the lid and look inside, and it would still look as if it had been fashioned entirely of solid metal. If you were smart, you did this when the host or hostess was not in the room, or you would be committing a social gaffe of your own. Coffee pots could also be fashioned out of Chinese export porcelain, out of ceramic, out of stoneware and creamware, which was not just cream, by the way. Think tortoiseshell ware, which is the second example here on the screen, or cauliflower ware. There was a real interest in ceramic vegetables. I have found coffee pots not only that look like cauliflower, but that look like corn, or tomatoes, or aubergine, which we call eggplant, agate ware, and even painted tin, which is the last example. All of these richly decorated, which ensured that there are options for displaying personal taste and a sense of style, regardless of where you are on the social economic ladder. Shipments from family and friends could also fill in some of your coffee set gaps. Writing from London in 1758, the year he first published The Way to Wealth, Benjamin Franklin described gifts that he was sending back to his wife, Deborah. And I have to admit that this particular letter, I did not find it in the archive. A former colleague of mine found it in the archive, and she loved it because she thought it displayed this beautiful personal moment, a glimpse of the interrelationships between Benjamin and Deborah Franklin. So he was describing a beer jug, which he thought looked like a fat lady dame, clean and tidy, with a neat blue and calico gown, good-natured and lovely, which put him in mind of somebody, ... I am hoping that someone is Deborah. I am assuming that someone was Deborah, although with Franklin, you never knew. That's not the sentence that caught my attention. What caught my attention was the very next sentence that she had never seen, because packed within that jar, nestled in the best crystal salt for added protection, were coffee cups, decorated with figures that Franklin urged Deborah to study closely with your spectacles on, as they bear examining. Underlying this growing interest in coffee, however, was a persistent reliance on the imperial marketplace, because just as British North American colonists imported all of their beans, they also imported most of their coffee pots, their sugar bowls, their cream pitchers, their spoons, whether fashioned of silver, of porcelain, or ceramic. In other words, British North American colonists depended on others to grow, to process, and to ship their coffee, as well as to produce nearly everything needed to prepare and serve it. It could be an extensive, and at times an expensive habit. It was also increasingly a political decision. Now, there is a common misunderstanding. Indeed, let me give you the misunderstanding. There is a common misunderstanding that America's interest in coffee rose as that in tea fell. And for a few short months, in 1773 and 1774, that might have been true. I have found a couple of examples. An English visitor to Alexandria, Virginia, for example, in July of 1774, witnessed the election of town burgesses and later wrote in his diary, "In the evening, George Washington gave a ball to the freeholders and gentlemen of the town. This was conducted with great harmony, coffee and chocolate, but no tea, which is in disgrace amongst them at present. Even the Boston Tea Party has its coffee moment, when William Russell, a school teacher who participated in the uprising, reputedly went home that evening, emptied his family's tea canister into the fire, and wrote 'coffee' on one side. And then, as if that was not clear enough, 'no tea' on the other side." But the problem is this. In 1774, North Americans expanded the range of goods that they were embargoing to try to put pressure on Parliament, from British goods to all British imperial goods, which included the Caribbean, which is where their coffee came from, remember, right? This effectively ended its potential as a patriotic proxy. But it does not, of course. Oh, so what did I do recently? So earlier this week, I got an email from a gentleman who's writing a piece for NPR about the Boston Tea Party, and he wanted to know how it might relate to the early history of coffee. And I thought, I know where you're going to go with this. I know where you're going to go with this. But I said, sure, I'll talk to you. And I gave him those two stories, but I said, I fear that if your argument is going to be that we became a coffee drinking nation after the Boston Tea Party, I am about to let you down. Because coffee was very popular and very common before 1773 and the Boston Tea Party. By the end of our hour-long conversation, he said, I think I shall have to have another focus. I said, my work is done. His work was just beginning. It does not, of course, mean that once coffee was now on the embargoed list, that people had lost their taste for the beverage. And that's what led to the standoff between Thomas Boylston and those women that I was describing at the beginning of my talk. But it does demonstrate that there were differences of opinion. In this case, I am going back to Abigail and John Adams, who are the fourth, 4 out of 6, 2/3 of the way through, 4 out of 6, Abigail and John Adams, who are the fourth actors in today's story. Perhaps these actions of Boylston weighed especially heavy on Abigail's mind because it was her husband's cousin, and the man after whom they had named their third child. But she complained that his were the actions of an eminent, wealthy, and stingy merchant, and clearly her neighbors agreed. They demanded the keys, and when he complied, they entered the property and hoisted out the coffee themselves, this is Abigail writing, put it into a truck and drove off. Abigail concluded her remarkable account by describing how a large concourse of men stood amazed, having remained silent spectators for the whole transaction. Now, I do want to say, these women did not steal the coffee. The ultimate conclusion of this story is they took it and they sold it publicly at what they thought were reasonable prices. But John saw things differently. When he wrote back, he stressed that his hope was that females will leave off their attachment to coffee, as it created, he argued, an untenable dependence on foreign trade. I assure you, he concluded, the best families in this place, by which he meant Philadelphia, have left off in great measure the use of West India goods. We must bring ourselves to live upon the produce of our own country, in case you thought Buy American was a modern concept. At first glance, this sounds a little bit like the far better known Boston Tea Party, which took place only a few years earlier and pit a handful of patriots against the vast machinery of empire. That familiar tale has all of the necessary elements of a good intrigue: disguises, bravery, dark of night, and a clearly identified enemy, East Indian tea, as well as a pithy rallying cry. This is the audience participation moment of this afternoon. I even gave it to you on the screen, so there's really no excuse for not participating. That rallying cry, of course, is no taxation without representation. Thank you very much. But like most slogans, this one reduces a complicated historical event into an easily digestible soundbite, when the reality was much messier. For as the showdown between Boylston and these women demonstrate, this time in the light of day and face to face, more than one commodity was causing problems. Moreover, while the Boston Tea Party was an effort to limit consumption, Boston's coffee rioters sought the opposite. They wanted access to more. Colonial legislators ultimately sided with Abigail. Recognizing that colonists were unlikely to give up their coffee, they chose instead to fix the price per pound to avoid precisely the kind of gouging that women were accusing Boylston of committing. Delegates from Massachusetts met first with their counterparts in New Hampshire and Rhode Island and Connecticut, but their actions were very soon copied in places like New York and Philadelphia. The result, which was published in the newspapers, was an act to prevent monopolies and oppression by excessive and unreasonable prices. I told you this was going to resonate. More than 20 goods were singled out as essential for the public welfare, and coffee was among them. If you take these things together, Legislation and public protest reveal how popular coffee had become in North America by the 1770s. Coffee drinking was not the practice of a privileged few, like tea had been. It was the daily and demanded habit of the many, considered as important to protect as wheat and pork and butter and potatoes. Indeed, North Americans drank so much coffee by the end of the Revolutionary Era that when U.S. politicians were casting about to try to identify goods to tax in aid of the public revenue, coffee topped the list. South Carolina began taxing coffee in 1783. Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania all passed similar taxes within the next few years. And while taxation might seem ironic given the role that it played in creating the new nation's political independence, state governments needed to balance their budgets. And they continued to rely on coffee's widespread population to generate a steady income. But where that coffee came from looked very different than it had before 1776. Rather than Jamaica or any other colony within the British Empire, the coffee that most North Americans drank after 1783 was much more likely to come from Spanish or Dutch, but especially French colonies, sometimes legally and sometimes less so. And this brings us to the fifth person in today's presentation, Pierre Rondeon, a free black overseer who in 1792 piloted 2 canoes carrying 16 bags of coffee from Roseau, which is the capital city of the small island of Dominica. Soon after he set sail, he was hailed by another vessel, and although Rondeon initially ignored the request, he testified that a musket or some other gun was fired across the canoe, so he stopped for fear that he or one of the enslaved workers with whom he was traveling might be injured. The ship that approached them was a British frigate. And through a translator, because like many Dominican residents, Rondeon spoke French, Dominica was a very small island, but it had traded hands between the British and the French Empire multiple times over the 18th century. So you had an English-speaking population, you had a French-speaking population, and you had Creole languages developed between these languages, between these traditions as well. He asked where the coffee was being ferried to, and Rondeon replied that he was taking it to Basseterre, which was the capital city of the neighboring island of Guadeloupe, which was French. Remember, Dominica is British. When pressed for more information about the ultimate destination of this coffee, he speculated that it would probably go to the United States, as North American ships, he said, frequently visited that French colony. So the problem was this: selling British coffee outside the empire without paying export taxes was illegal. And Alms asked to see the cargo's customs papers. Rondeon responded that he had none and had been long accustomed to carrying coffee in this manner and never heard of such a thing being required. The merchants that had hired him moved quickly back in Roseau to handle the situation and persuaded the courts that the overseer had misunderstood their instructions. And the coffee was released into their custody with a strong recommendation to get the appropriate paperwork henceforth. But by his own admission, in his testimony, and this was coming from a court docket that's still housed in the Dominica National Archives, he had been coordinating the movement of coffee between Dominica and French islands for years. Given the length of his employment, I find a misunderstanding to be a little suspect. Instead, I suspect that these were 2 out of an untold number of canoes that Rondeon and others had successfully piloted beyond British imperial borders to supply the coffee needs of North America. Now, smuggling was one way to do so, but there were other ways of moving coffee around in the post-revolutionary world and into the U.S. market. Some colonial governors simply turned a blind eye, more interested in the goods that the U.S. might trade for coffee than in enforcing British imperial law. Some custom officials even collaborated, doctoring papers to transform vessels, U.S. vessels, into a British ship or a French ship or a Spanish ship. There's a wonderful collection of papers in Kingston, Jamaica, about a minor customs official who literally writes to merchants and says, "What would you like your ship to be?" for a fee. I mean, it wasn't free, but it could be done. And some empires experimented with free ports, which are what they sounded like, basically hubs for tax-free commerce. Think of it as the 18th century equivalent of duty-free. But all of these tactics, special concessions or colonial collusion or even outright smuggling, only brought a certain amount of coffee into the United States, and Americans wanted more. To get it, they turned increasingly to the French West Indies, which accounted for more than 60% of all coffee sold to North America in 1789, a share that rose to 77% just 2 years later. The leading partner, this is table 3, I promise, we're done. This is the last table. The leading partner in this pattern was a colony called Saint-Domingue. We now call it Haiti, which sent less than 500,000 pounds of beans to the United States by 1789, but almost 4 million pounds 5 years after that. It was a spectacularly profitable business for almost 2 decades, until the Haitian Revolution, which ended slavery in Saint-Domingue, and more importantly, when the American government decided to embargo all trade with the newly independent nation in 1806. U.S. merchants searched again for a regular coffee supplier, and this time, the answer was Brazil. Coffee had been a minor industry in the Portuguese colony through the 1810s, overshadowed by both sugar and cotton. But the gap created in the coffee market after the Haiti's Revolution resulted in patterns both there and in the United States that would become spectacularly profitable for both nations. For Brazil, what sparked this change was its independence from the Empire of Portugal in 1822. For the United States, it was an odd combination of taxes and temperance. Think back to what I told you about states deciding to tax coffee after the American Revolution to raise state revenue. Their success caught the eye of Alexander Hamilton when he was arguing for federal tariffs on foreign goods, especially, he wrote, coffee, sugar, tobacco, and tea. Now, 2 of these, sugar and tobacco, also grew in the United States, so taxing what came from abroad would help to bolster domestic production. But despite the best efforts of botanists and entrepreneurs, no domestic option had been discovered for coffee. In fact, if you're looking for a question during the Q&A, ask me, did we ever try to grow coffee in North America? It's a good story. In 1828, no less than Andrew Jackson entered the fray, arguing that the duties on those articles of importation that cannot come into competition with our own productions are the first that should engage the attention of Congress in the modification of the tariff. Tariffs. We are talking about tariffs. Of these, he said, tea and coffee are the most important. They enter largely into the consumption of the country and have become articles of necessity to all classes. A reduction, therefore, of existing duties will be felt as a common benefit, and he was persuasive. In 1832, exactly 1 century after Britain first repealed taxes to encourage coffee planting in the Caribbean, the United States became the only nation in the world not to tax foreign coffee. I know, imagine today. The following year, imports more than doubled. 20 years, they doubled again. But if U.S. importers recognized their increasing dependence on one supplier, most coffee drinkers remain largely unaware. Instead, coffee's marketers and sellers very consciously aligned themselves with U.S. interests and images, as well as the nation's expansionist dreams. Take, for example, this advertisement from Old Dominion, touting its coffee and its coffee pots as part of the rich historical legacy of Virginia. There is a state, well known to fame, that every man admires, the noblest of the old 13, the state that never tires, the mother, she, of presidents. And it is our intention to show that she has given birth through genius and invention to something more than one who rules the people of a nation that is a boon to bless mankind throughout this vast creation. Buyers, in other words, were encouraged to see their purchases from Old Dominion as more than just a way to brew coffee. They were choosing to support a U.S.-based business with global aspirations. Let us pause and reflect on the moment that they have said that the expansion of coffee consumption was a better export out of Virginia than its first 4 presidents. John Arbuckles, who founded the Pittsburgh-based company, Arbuckles and Company, is the 6th and final person you will meet today in this presentation, and he was a master at this kind of rebranding. Arbuckles had worked in grocery retail for nearly 2 decades when he perfected and then patented a glaze of egg white and confectioner's sugar to coat coffee beans while roasting. He invested, the patents that come with coffee are really fascinating in the 19th century. He invested full scale in this one industry, and this is when you do begin to see the rise of the large coffee merchants for the first time. But at a time when most vendors were still selling whole beans in paper bags, Arbuckles and Company sold its products roasted, ground, and sealed in reusable tins. This resulted in a more consistent product and better packaging. But he did more than that. Arbuckles sent agents to São Paulo in Brazil to cultivate relationships with coffee exporters directly. He invested in Brazilian railroads to ease transportation from the mountainous interior to the coast, and he bought a shipping fleet to bring beans directly from Brazilian suppliers to his factories. And while I could not find evidence that Arbuckles directly contributed to what became a profitable, if illegal, continuation of the transatlantic slave trade to Brazil, some of his fellow U.S. merchants certainly did so. And they all benefited from the continuation of slavery in that country until 1888, the last nation in the Americas to end chattel bondage. You would see none of this, of course, in the advertising for Arbuckles Coffee. Instead, he chose to align his flagship brand, Ariosa Coffee, with ideas of national expansion and flourishing patriotism. He developed a series of trading cards, which was a common sales gimmick in the 19th century, to link his still foreign-grown coffee to key events and places in U.S. history. The most popular of these became known as the MAP series, one card for each state, that included facts like square mileage and population, accompanied by an image of the state's primary industry. So, grapes for California, silver mining for Colorado, pottery for New Jersey. Would you like to guess what Virginia's was? Tobacco. Yeah, definitely. And there were helpful hints for how to brew coffee on the reverse of each of these cards. In this sense, Arbuckles was shaping his coffee consumers' understandings of their nation, allowing drinkers to celebrate the seemingly unstoppable triumph of economic expansion, all while sipping on what they now considered to be the nation's brew. It was a masterful and very profitable sleight of hand, and it is how, I argue, coffee became Americanized. Now, depending on the time or place, coffee has been characterized as exotic, as common, as foreign, as patriotic. The industry is bound up with the histories of colonization, enslavement, revolution, and nationalism. The United States remains one of the largest buyers of coffee in the world, and Brazil remains one of its largest suppliers. This is a web of interdependence that is now more than 2 centuries old, and last year it generated $8.2 billion. That is the story of Coffee Nation, an Ethiopian plant transplanted first to the East Indies before being brought across the Atlantic to become a staple crop of the Caribbean, produced by thousands of enslaved people. This same beverage, becoming a leading import into Philadelphia, redistributed well beyond the city to other colonies and the backcountry. It is also the story of how coffee and coffee houses became embroiled in revolutionary activity, turning what had been sites of business into platforms of protest. And ultimately, how the United States invested in the products of other nations, first in the West Indies and then in Brazil, to create a global coffee network on which it depends and which persists to this day. Thank you. I'm going to let these gentlemen duke it out with the microphones as to who gets to speak first. Okay.
So you already mentioned that coffee consumption was substantial in the United States prior to the Revolutionary War.
Mm-hmm.
Why was it not substantial in England?
Oh, it was. It was. In fact, the tradition of coffee drinking and coffee houses migrates from Western Europe into North America. Coffee houses, if the very first chapter, I had a whole chapter on English coffee houses. I really loved that chapter. It is not in the book. This is one of you have a tussle with your publisher as to what ultimately moves into publication. And he said, this is a really wonderful chapter. Your book is not about England. Your book is about North America. And I went, wow. And he was right. But there was an earlier look at how coffee house culture expanded, both in England, in France, in Amsterdam, in various places throughout Western Europe. So it was definitely an embedded tradition before it moved across the Atlantic. In fact, the first documented coffee grinder, a mortar and pestle, was part of the Mayflower. It was brought over by pilgrims many of whom were migrants coming from Amsterdam, where coffee drinking already was an established practice. So coffee houses are very popular in England. What's interesting is, a better question might be, when did coffee drinking begin to phase out and tea become so popular? Because the first time I will say that I did research in England, I was in Oxford. This was many years ago. Now you can find coffee houses. They have respread. But I searched in vain for what I thought of as an American-style coffee house when I was first in London. And what coffee I could find was almost always instant, which I know. I know. But no, in the 17th century, there was a strong proliferation of coffee houses. For example, in London, there's well-documented cases of people who are drinking coffee. They became affiliated with different political parties. They became affiliated with business activity, and it was those practices that also followed the tradition across the Atlantic into the New World. The first North American coffee house was established in 1676 in Boston, but then the number of coffee houses spread very rapidly throughout most urban centers in North America.
First of all, I'd like to say you are a fantastic presenter.
Thank you.
That was very enjoyable.
Thank you.
My question is, the Jane Shippen that you mentioned, any relation to Peggy Shippen?
Yes, actually, it is the same family. They're not directly related, but they're branches of within the same family. So Peggy Shippen, for those of you who don't know, is ultimately affiliated with Benedict Arnold. And so yes, this is the same Shippen family of Philadelphia, whose papers reside predominantly at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Excellent question.
I'll go ahead and take your bait. How did coffee growing in the United States go?
Not so good. But they really tried. I mean, and you can understand why. There had been other Caribbean commodities that had been successfully transplanted to North America. Think about, for example, the sugar plantations of Louisiana, right? After we acquire it from Napoleon. But ultimately, and there were efforts. So here's my favorite. I love it for a host of reasons. First, it's a really great story and there's wonderful documentation. Second, in 1819, a former Saint-Domingue coffee planter named Pierre Stephen Chazot migrates. First he moves from Saint-Domingue during the Haitian Revolution, and he goes to France for a while. And then he decides he's going to come to North America. So he comes back through the Caribbean and then is on a ship coming up to Philadelphia. It blows off course into Florida. Bear with me. Blows off course into Florida, ultimately comes into Philadelphia. He writes a series of pamphlets about everything from how to grow olives, how to grow grapes, why learning French is an important skill in Philadelphia, as well as other foreign languages. We did not listen to him, but it would have been nice if we had. He was interested in music, he was interested in banking, but he was really interested in coffee because he'd been a coffee planter. And he puts together an organization called the East Florida Coffee Land Association. Because when he had been blown off course in Florida, he saw a land of sunshine. He saw a land of opportunity. And we had recently only acquired Florida to become part of the United States. And candidly, nobody really knew what to do with it. So it was not a far-fetched idea. So he and his organization petitioned Congress. This is when different groups are trying to get land grants. So he petitions Congress for acres and acres and acres and acres of East Florida to produce coffee plantations. No worries. I know, it's very startling. To produce coffee plantations. And so you can track this in the congressional record. He writes to leading U.S. politicians. He gets the input of a variety of different people. He stages in Philadelphia a grand voyage where he is going to move south to Florida so that they can stake their claim when Congress finally comes through. And you can track their appearance as they move south in various newspapers in cities where they land. There's a lot of enthusiasm. What I really like about his petition to Congress is that he couches all of this activity in the language of patriotism. Like, I could not have asked for a better author. He says, growing our own coffee will release the United States from our dependence on foreign nations. But it was a good dream. Growing our own coffee, having an established plantation system in Florida will create a bulwark against smuggling coming in from the south. It will take land that is currently unused and make it profitable. It will contribute to our gross national product. And the report has tremendous numbers of figures about how much coffee we import, from where, how much we spend on it, and this is revenue that we could be creating and keeping within the United States. By the time they reach Florida, they have rebranded themselves as the United States Coffee Land Association, right? So they have all of this sort of language of national fervor. Their report contains all sorts of data, wind, currents, latitude, longitude. What it does not really account for, though, is altitude. So coffee, Arabica coffee, because this is what we're talking about at this point, Arabica coffee grows well at 2,000 feet above sea level. It grows really well at 4,000 feet above sea level. Has anyone been to Key Largo? Would anyone like to take a guess as to what the average above sea level is for East Florida? Right, 2 feet, I hear negative. Both are true, right? Many parts of East Florida are below sea level. It never would have worked. But it was a really good faith effort, and there's more than one. But that one had the most documentation. There's more than one effort. There are state efforts and national efforts to try to create an alternative for coffee. None of them are very good. They tried something called Kentucky coffee. Even good heavens, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Benjamin Barton, who was one of the leading botanists of Philadelphia, all become invested in Kentucky coffee before they decide it tastes dreadful. They tried roasting chicory. That still happens, in parts of the United States throughout the 19th century, especially in Louisiana. They tried roasting rye and grain. Yeah. Now, not only does it not taste good, there is no caffeine, so you don't get the buzz. You just get dirty water. And if you're going to be using grain to create some sort of beverage, we already have one, and it's a lot better than a faux coffee. So it ends up being, we do not, so this is fun. Toward the conclusion, I say there is no domestic coffee. There's no way for North America to claim a domestic source of coffee until we change what North America is. When we annex Hawaii and Puerto Rico, now we have domestic coffee. And you better believe that people who are selling that coffee, there's this wonderful example from Sanborn and Company of a metal tin coffee box that has a huge picture. It's Uncle Sam saying, drink our Sanborn and Company coffee from our own U.S. dominions in Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and Guam. But that's really the only time we can actually claim to have a domestic source of coffee. Thank you for asking that question.
To what extent do you think the habit-forming nature of caffeine contributed to the increasing interest and demand for whatever for coffee?
It absolutely contributed, and it was well understood as early. It was well understood in Western Europe before coffee even comes to North America that it was habit forming. They recognized the connection between coffee and wakefulness. They recognized the connection between coffee and headaches if you stop drinking it. They recognize the connection between coffee and inebriation, which is to say one might potentially be the antidote for the other. It's also associated with a variety of other medical conditions. It does not cure gout. It does not cause infertility. It does not cure flatulence, though people claimed all of the same. But there was definitely well understood connections between coffee and its impact on the body. And it's also, and I don't know if I made this clear enough in the presentation, one of the reasons why coffee was so broad and much broader spread than tea is it was so much less expensive. Coffee was at least a third of what tea would cost per pound. So it's much more accessible to a much broader range of drinkers. The challenge is that tea in U.S. history has this wonderful galvanizing episode of the Boston Tea Party, and then, of course, of the Tea Act and reactions to the Tea Act and people wanting to limit importation of tea and limit consumption of tea. It became like wearing homespun as opposed to imported cloth, a sign of your patriotism not to drink tea. Coffee doesn't have that same sort of fulsome history behind it. And so we focus on tea and affiliate it with early American culture when, in fact, coffee, because it's so less expensive, is much more broadly consumed even before 1776. But yes, well understood about the connection between coffee and its impact on the body, and even tea and its impact on the body.
We're going to have time for just one more question.
There is one very patient man down front, though. He has been trying.
Okay.
Oh, no, I didn't mean not you. No, I meant we could have two. I'm sorry.
Where's the question?
Right here.
There you go, sir.
So moving into a contemporary issue, climate has had an increasing impact on production of coffee. Brazil is one country that's suffered a lot. I'm thinking of the west coast of the U.S. and the possible emergence of coffee as an alternative in the west coast to grapes.
I still don't think we're going to get the altitude, though. Grapes are still grown at a lower elevation, but it's an interesting idea. I will say, you're absolutely right. And also I will add that I shouldn't, well, actually, let me backstep for just a moment. Altitude is less of a question when you're talking about coffee production now, because you're talking about both Arabica and Robusta coffee. So Robusta, and there are different qualities of coffee. There's different adherence to drinkers. If you're looking for pure Arabica, it's definitely more expensive. It can only grow in certain regions. Robusta, as its name would imply, is much more robust. It can be grown at lower elevations, and Brazil grows both Arabica and Robusta coffee. But increasingly, if you're looking at a coffee blend, if you're looking at pre-ground coffee, if you're looking at, God help you, freeze-dried coffee or instant coffee, you're looking increasingly at Robusta coffee. And it's grown in many other places of the world than Arabica could ever have grown. One of the largest producers of Robusta coffee today, we don't have time. Otherwise, I would say, go ahead and guess. Vietnam. Yeah, Vietnam. So I don't know if coffee is really going to enter mainstream North America, continental North America, but you are absolutely right. There are several challenges to ongoing coffee production. One of them is climate. The other is just a real, not an interest in younger generations in investing. I looked at a number of contemporary reports by global coffee nonprofits, and one of the real challenges is it remains largely a very small farmer-oriented activity, and so there just is not the same level of interest in economic in investing in coffee farming. It's going to become a problem. I know they're all like, now coffee lasts for years, beans last for years and years. Buy them, stockpile them, become your own Thomas Boylston. No, I'm just kidding. Don't do that. Okay.
Oh, thank you. My question is actually a little bit related to the last question. Coffee, it seems to me, is like an invasive species to the Caribbean. And I was curious as to what the environmental impact of coffee cultivation in that time period was, and if it was related to the colonial expansion project of the Atlantic world.
Okay, I'm going to take the second part first, and I know it's the last question, so I'll try to be concise. It absolutely contributed to the colonial expansion project, but the nature of coffee farming, particularly in the 18th century, was very different than, say, sugar farming or sugar cultivation, whereas sugar cultivation required the elimination of local vegetation to create large-scale, massive farms. Most coffee farms, not all, there were some large coffee farms, but most coffee farms were much more were smaller enterprises with fewer than 50 people. In fact, in Jamaica, in many cases, fewer than 25, and they were grown in entirely different parts of those islands. They required that mountainous inland area, and so there was far less clear cutting and more coffee farms built into the local flora and fauna. So there wasn't the same kind of environmental impact as you have, for example, in sugar cultivation or in mahogany logging that happened in places like Brazil or earlier in places in the Caribbean like Jamaica. But it is an excellent question, and I will end with one anecdote because you're right. There's been increasingly in the last couple of decades, right, a real interest in trying to think about the environmental impact of our commodities and how we consume. So shade-grown coffee has become really important, which is grown within shade, so not to cut down local species and different animal habitats, particularly songbird. Their songbird coffee was popular for a while. And then free trade coffee was one of the first ways in which people were trying to find a free trade was guaranteeing a sustainable wage for coffee growers. I do remember the first time I saw free trade coffee. I walked into a Starbucks and the barista was very proudly demonstrating to me what free trade coffee was and that all of these various coffees here on this wall were certified as free trade. And I said, that is really interesting and that's a very laudable project. I am just curious, what about these coffees over here? And the barista looked at me kind of shocked and I thought that was kind of an unfair question. Nonetheless. But no, I think you're right. There is increasingly a recognition of the need to think about both the economic impact of coffee and the environmental impact of coffee. But we're still a far ways. Yeah.
Okay then. So I think that's about all we have time for today. Thank you, Dr. McDonald, for a really informative and engaging presentation. And I just want to remind you all, because we've had a great Q&A session, Dr. McDonald, in a few short moments, will be in Commonwealth Hall signing books, answering any more questions that you might have. And just as a reminder, Coffee Nation is available in our gift shop. So thank you so much for your support and your attendance. And thank you, Dr. McDonald.
And thank you all so much for coming.